Russia, according to some reports, has completely stopped trying to get their captured POWs home. Why would a major European power just abandon its soldiers? We are going to take a look at the Kiev Post reporting, and I'm going to give you guys some more analysis of what I think is actually really going on. So let's get right into it.
Has one goal for such units: to finish off the unfinished ones.
This is a reference to an earlier report where they talked about Russia actually returning wounded soldiers to combat units, which is so preposterous that I would need to see a second source on it, because I can't believe they would send wounded soldiers back to combat units.
Troops extends to those in Ukrainian captivity. Kiev Post recently visited Ukraine's only dedicated camp for Russian POWs. Russian soldiers interviewed there said they had essentially been abandoned by the Kremlin and did not know if they could ever return home.
Вы знаете, вы в списках есть?
Я толком не знаю ничего. Звонил сестре своей в Москву. Она опять звонила вам в часть. Сказали, что тебя никто не будет обменивать. Почему? Потому что ты...
So this is interesting when we juxtapose this leak against the leaked calls that we've heard from many other Russian soldiers, because they report that they are not receiving documentation that they've been deployed to Ukraine. They're not receiving any sort of official orders that have relocated them to the war zone. And those soldiers believe that they some of them are naive and seem to operate as though the Russian government has simply, it's a mere oversight. And once they talk to someone in the right seat of the bureaucracy, they'll remedy that right away. But the more realistic soldiers in the Russian armed forces seem to know that Russia is trying to conceal the scale and reality of the operation from the Russian public. So by denying that these POWs were ever here, is just another part of that, right? Because again, it's a bad look for Russia to have these POWs. For example, if they say, one of Russia's public statements is to say, oh, there's been 10,000 casualties in the entirety of their special military operation. Well, if you have 10,000 POWs get repatriated in a year, the public's going to go, well, what do you mean? How are there this many POWs, but there's not that many casualties, right? Imagine if in the Iraq War, there were 7,000 U.S. service members held by the Taliban. People would be like, dude, there's no way. There is no way there were only 6,000 soldiers killed and the Taliban captured that many alive. Not possible, right? So that's, I think, part of this. And you see here, he says Russia, or at least his command, says he had allegedly defected to Ukraine. I think that's actually pretty plausible, given the low morale of Russian troops, the fact that he was captured relatively unharmed. But again, it wouldn't take much. And it also, the Russian government has an incentive to call him a defector, because if you're a defector, if you commit treason, then presumably you're not entitled to benefits. I mean, that's how it works in the United States, and the U.S. government is not. The U.S. government is happy to spend money. Okay, the Russian government pretty cheap. So I suspect that they may simply have a policy that says all POWs are declared deserters and aren't entitled to military benefits and are no longer a priority for release.
Перешел на сторону Украины, и что я приду. Так как это плохо, конечно.
Плохо.
Конечно, плохо. Я пошел, и меня не хотят обменивать, я не знаю как.
Меня мать позвонила в Министерство обороны, и я нигде не числюсь в России. Сказали, что такого бойца вообще не было никогда.
See, what did we talk about? They said he had never been a fighter in Ukraine at all, which is Russia's government's official stance. And it's possible if he was a member of, say, a contract unit, like a Stormzy or a Wagner soldier, then the Russian government may be correct. They may be like, yo, dude, you were never a fighter. You were only ever a contractee.
So what's going on here, given that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said in August that returning Russian POWs was a priority for the Kremlin? According to Ukrainian authorities, there are a couple things at play. Ukrainian intelligence spokesperson Andriy Yusov told Kiev Post that one of the reasons Russia doesn't want its soldiers to come home is because they've seen the truth about what is happening in Ukraine. He said, "A harsh repressive system operates in Russia, and the military personnel who have already been returned from Ukrainian captivity go through a whole series of procedures under the pressure of their authorities, so that the actual truth does not come out. The truth about who is the real aggressor and criminal."
Okay, I'm a little skeptical that it's about that. I think it's much more likely that Russia may not want the POWs to come out and say things like, "We're losing this war." In the Vietnam War, it was extremely common to see American service members who returned from the war come back and be its most vocal critics and say this war is pointless, that we're fighting for nothing, we are losing this war. And to see that was a huge boost to the U.S. anti-war movement, because remember, the anti-war movement was painted by its critics at the time as being unpatriotic, individuals who were shirking their patriotic duty. And so it was massively damaging to the U.S. to have actual uniformed service members who hadn't shirked their patriotic duty, who had served their country honorably, oftentimes receiving awards, and then come in and say, actually, I did this, but I still think this war is stupid and pointless and achieves very little. So I think that is one of the most uncomfortable things that they may have to deal with. You also, of course, have the fact that they may come back and say things like, the Ukrainians treated me well, they weren't evil, because, the Ukrainians as I'll get demonetized if I use Ukrainians as being fascists. You know what I'm talking about. That's an important narrative. And Ukrainians as hating ethnic Russians is another central theme of Putin's propaganda that justifies the conflict. So to have POWs that counter that narrative, or return to POWs countering that narrative, would be very challenging for the Kremlin.
Another factor is how their treatment in Ukrainian captivity compares with what they were told would happen. Another Russian POW told Kiev Post he had been ordered to kill himself with a grenade rather than face what he'd been told would be Ukrainian torture. Russia clearly doesn't want its troops to learn that being a POW is a far safer and comfier option than fighting on the front lines. The same can't be said of the conditions faced by Ukrainian POWs in Russian captivity, as evidenced by the pictures of them on their release.
Yeah, these are clearly soldiers who were starved. And, the rules in the Geneva Convention are that your soldiers and POWs are offered the same rations, the same medical care, but the priority should always go to your soldiers. So it's possible Ukrainian POWs may still be Geneva compliant to not treat them, given how high Russian casualties are. But just you can see, right? This is an emaciated man, and you can only lose that much weight if you are deprived for a long period of time of your basic caloric needs. And we've seen Russian soldiers, POWs, individuals in combat footage. They don't look like this. They don't look like they're being starved out. So it's fairly clear that they're receiving some level of adequate ration. And again, these Ukrainian POWs probably are not. Which is a Geneva Convention violation.
Aspect is that Russia appears to be weaponizing the prisoner swaps, or lack of them, as part of a wider operation to sow discord in Ukrainian society. The Kremlin is blaming Kyiv for the lack of prisoner swaps, portraying the Ukrainian government as not caring about its own soldiers.
I also want to point out that Ukraine has an incentive to follow the law of war. That's pretty tremendous, because its European and United States partners, as a condition of providing these weapons, say that, hey, Ukraine has to maintain, to the best of its ability, compliance with the Geneva Convention and law of war. And if it fails to do so, then you end up in a situation where again, the U.S. public can turn against the war. Bear in mind, the Iraq War, and during the initial invasion and the first year or two of war, it was actually fairly popular with the public. The public supported the war effort. But when the images from the Abu Ghraib detention center were leaked to the public, and they found that U.S. soldiers were torturing and humiliating Iraqi detainees, the U.S. public said, what are we doing there? We were supposed to be the good guys. We're supposed to be liberators. And instead, we are sadists. We're the bad guys here. And it was a huge tectonic shift in the entire war because many Iraqis did sort of support the U.S. They were like, I wasn't a big fan of Saddam. He was kind of a jerk. Yeah, the Americans speak a different language. They have a different religion. But, they're not horrible to us. And then they saw those images and the Iraqi sentiment flipped and the American sentiment also pushed heavily towards being against the war. So the treatment of POWs, if I was to see images, for example, if Ukraine was to be torturing Russian POWs or starving them or keeping them in inhumane conditions, I too would be like, this is wrong. This is morally reprehensible. As I talk about, right, like Russian soldiers, still human beings, many of them coerced to fight. They wouldn't deserve that kind of treatment. And so they don't receive it, right? So, in a way, you and I, the public, are the ones who passively or actively are demanding that Russian POWs are treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention.
Relatives of Ukrainian POWs have held regular protests in Kyiv and around the country, demanding the government do more to return their loved ones. The Kremlin appears to be attempting to stoke these protests into wider social discontent while simultaneously stalling the prisoner swap process. Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets said on November 30th, the lack of exchanges became an element of the Russian operation, so that the relatives of the defenders believed that the Ukrainian authorities were not doing anything to return the soldiers. And holding Russian POWs is not cheap for Ukraine. Each POW costs around $270 a month, and the ever-increasing number of Russian POWs means a new camp will soon be needed, costing several million hryvnias. Despite the many hurdles, Ukraine says it is dedicated to doing everything it can to get its own POWs back. Yusuf said the hard work of the negotiations.
So again, this is also pretty interesting, and this is one of the reasons why the Geneva Convention included this treatment of POWs, because when you have a military where there's mass surrenders, again, the Iraqi military in the first Gulf War is a classic example, when whole companies, whole battalions of these poor Iraqi conscripts would just throw down their arms immediately when faced with the American forces. I mean, again, imagine you're an Iraqi 19-year-old conscript. You might not even be able to read, and you're facing down like Apaches and F-16s and, an Iowa-class battleship or whatever, just like lobbing rounds over your head in Basra. They're like, no, this isn't worth it. Like, you could throw down your weapon, but the result was tens of thousands of POWs. It was a massive undertaking to try to just get them documented. Who are you? Let me see your documentation. Are you who you say you are? Are you really a 19-year-old private, or are you a general's son, or someone or a diplomat, or a wanted war criminal who's masquerading as someone else, right? Verify their identities, get them fed, get them in a camp, get them treated humanely and properly, and then go on from there. So the reason I say that is because it adds up quickly. 10,000 people, 100,000 people, right? That's not an unbelievable number for a military. Russia has 300,000 people in the field. Feeding a literal army, providing medical treatment to a literal army is so complex and so expensive that when you're already stretched to your own limit as a military, it can be a real burden. And again, that's why the external pressure of the West and Western partners is absolutely essential to maintaining the basic level of humanity in this conflict.
Negotiation group continues. and everything possible is being done to get results and get them soon. And that's it for today.
So, okay, there's a key point that I think the Post missed here that I really want to talk about. But first, before we talk about that key point, I want to just point out to you guys that I was in the gas station the other day. I got this energy drink. No kidding. This ran me $4, which is, I remember when these were $2.50 and I thought they were too expensive. But you see, I don't know if you can see, it has 160 calories in this thing, but also 41 grams of sugar. I swear, it's absolutely unbelievable. And for all this, you get 114 milligrams of caffeine. So $4, 100 milligrams of caffeine, and 40 grams of sugar. I obviously have been drinking these energy drinks for years, and finally I've designed an alternative. This is Strike Gum. It's my company. It's made here in the USA, obviously veteran owned, but each one of these individual pieces has 90 milligrams of caffeine in it, right? So almost as much as the Red Bull itself. The unnamed energy drink. But this has 0 sugar, refreshing mint flavor, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further cognitive enhancement. And this pack alone, 5 of these pieces, right? So the equivalent of 5 energy drinks, and the whole thing is like $5.99. So check us out at strikegum.com. Best of all, 50% of the profits from this first production run are getting donated to charities that support Ukrainian civilians who've been injured or displaced in the conflict. And if you're someone with a serious energy drink, like an everyday buy your energy drink at the gas station before work kind of guy, check out the tray. The tray is 75 pieces, so the equivalent of 75 energy drinks, which would be like $300 at a gas station. It's $79.99, right? And the nice thing is you don't have to stop. You just keep this in your glove box, in your center console, chew a piece. I mean, you can even just throw it in your pocket if you need a midday like pick me up. You've got it. You got it and go. So check us out, strikegum.com. Okay, the last point that I thought was most important here is that the exchanges are not one for one. And we know that Russia has sort of bifurcated its military. It has not highly trained, but relatively well-trained specialists who do things like operate the tanks, the MLRS systems, the artillery pieces, do some of the technical maintenance on helicopters, right? They have trained active duties military specialists, but there's an equal part of their military that is their assault groups, their so-called stormtroopers. These guys do just direct frontal assaults. And these guys are the ones who take the most casualties. They're also the ones most likely to become POWs because their job is literally to charge at Ukrainians, right? Your MLRS units never get close enough to a Ukrainian to surrender. And so what Russia loses, what it loses to those POW camps and frankly to Ukrainian weapons are their least capable soldiers. Those are the guys recruited from prisons, the guys who are alcoholics, the guys who are drug users, right? That's who they get and charging at the Ukrainians. Now, in contrast, Ukrainian infantry has been, in a lot of cases, trained by NATO countries, trained in small unit tactics, very well rehearsed, very well exercised. And oftentimes, if you're a POW, it means you've also got some combat experience. So Russia looks and it goes, listen, are we really going to trade a drunk that had a week of training and we're going to give Ukraine an experienced, fully trained infantryman trained to NATO standards? Like, this is not a one-for-one deal here, you know? And I think ultimately that is what Russia's looking at. Russia's like, you know what? You can have them. We have a whole prison system full of people who are just as good, who we can get into the battlefield in 4 days. We don't want these guys back. And, you know, Ukraine, of course, is like, no, we want our guys back. They're extremely valuable. They're highly trained. And from a lot of reports, Russia can do a lot more force generation much faster than Ukraine can. So for Russia, having one of their soldiers off the battlefield is worth it if it gets a Ukrainian soldier off the battlefield as well. So that's all I had, guys. Thank you so much, as always, and hit like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.